My room only has one bed, the lone rancher said, and Prudence felt her knees buckle. Her husband had been dead 4 months. Her husband's family had thrown her out the day after the funeral, calling her unnatural for her height and strength, saying she'd probably killed him with her mannish ways. She had 32 cents in her pocket and frostbite creeping up her toes. I'll spread my legs if that's what it takes to stay, she whispered, hating herself the moment the words left her mouth, hating the world that had brought her to this. Cade's hand froze on his hat, his jaw clenched. He stood abruptly from the bed, and Prue flinched. She'd seen that look before, men deciding whether she was worth the trouble. But when he stepped closer, his eyes were blazing with something that looked like fury. Not at her. For her. How long, his voice cracked, raw with emotion, how long have you been surviving on men's mercy? Prue's tears finally broke free, hot against her frozen cheeks. This stranger, this lone rancher, with his one bed and his worn hat and his modest cabin full of golden light, he'd just asked the question no one else had. Not, what will you do for me, but what have they done to you? Her breath came in ragged gasps. Since the day they buried Silas, since his brother told me to get out before sundown, since the banker laughed when I asked about our savings, said my husband had debts I didn't know about, said a woman like me should have expected he'd leave her with nothing. She wrapped her arms around herself, her wet black dress clinging to her shivering frame. I tried to find work, tried 5 towns. Nobody wants a woman who can outwork their men. They said I made their husbands feel small, made their sons feel weak. Cade's hands curled into fists at his sides. Something dark and protective surged through his chest, something he hadn't felt since he'd buried his wife Martha 3 winters ago. He'd shut himself off after that, sworn he'd never let another soul close enough to hurt him. But this woman, standing before him, this Prudence with her powerful shoulders and broken spirit, she was cracking something open inside him that he'd thought was dead forever. You'll take the bed, he said, his voice steady now, controlled. I'll sleep by the fire. Prue's eyes went wide. I can't take your bed without paying for it? Cade's voice went hard. Is that what you think? That every kindness in this world comes with a price tag attached? He moved to the fireplace, grabbed a thick wool blanket from the wooden chest beside it. Ma'am, I don't know what kind of men you've been dealing with, but I'm not them. You need shelter. I have shelter. That's the end of the transaction. But Prue couldn't accept it, couldn't believe it. 4 months of rejection had taught her that nothing came free, that her very existence was a burden people only tolerated if she made it worth their while. Why? The word came out, broken. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Cade turned back to face her, and for the first time, she saw the grief etched into the lines around his eyes, the loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. 3 years ago, my wife died in that bed. Childbirth. Baby didn't make it either. His voice was flat, emotionless, the way people talk when they've said something so many times it's lost all meaning. I know what it's like to beg God for mercy and get silence. I know what it's like when the world just keeps turning and expects you to turn with it, even when everything inside you is screaming to stop. He held her gaze. So yeah, I don't know you, but I know that look in your eyes, and I'll be damned if I turn you away. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling fire and the rain hammering against the windows. Prue stood there, dripping, trembling, staring at this stranger who'd just offered her something she'd thought didn't exist anymore. Kindness without conditions. Her throat worked, trying to form words, but nothing came out. She'd armored herself against cruelty, against rejection, against men's hungry eyes and women's disgusted sneers. But she had no armor against this, against gentleness, against being seen as a human being instead of a problem to be solved or a body to be used. I can work, she finally managed, her voice steadier now. I'm strong. I can fix fences, chop wood, handle livestock. I won't be a burden. I'll earn my keep. Cade's expression softened slightly. Tomorrow we can talk about work. And tonight, you need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia. He gestured toward a wooden partition in the corner. There's a privacy screen. My wife's old clothes are in that trunk. They'll be too short for you, but they're dry. Get changed, get warm, then we'll heat up some stew. Prue's legs nearly gave out again, but this time from relief so overwhelming it felt like drowning. She moved toward the partition on shaking limbs, then paused and looked back at him. Mr. Thornwell. Cade, he interrupted gently. Just Cade. Cade, she repeated, tasting his name like something precious. Thank you. I know those words aren't enough, but They're plenty, he said, already turning away to give her privacy. Now go get warm before you freeze to death in my cabin. That'd be a hell of a way to repay my hospitality. It was such a small joke, such a tiny attempt at lightness, but it hit Prue like a physical blow, because it meant he saw her as a person, someone worth joking with, someone worth treating like a human being instead of a charity case or a transaction. She disappeared behind the screen, peeling off her soaked dress with numb fingers, and let herself cry silently, not from despair this time, but from the terrifying, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place where she could stop running. Behind the wooden screen, Prue's fingers fumbled with the buttons of her wet dress, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the fabric. The cold had settled deep into her bones, but it wasn't just the cold making her tremble. It was the kindness, the unexpected, undeserved kindness of a stranger who'd looked at her desperate offer and responded with fury on her behalf instead of acceptance. She peeled the soaked black dress down her shoulders, the fabric clinging to her skin like ice, and reached for the trunk Kate had mentioned. Inside, folded with care that spoke of grief still fresh, were clothes that had belonged to a woman who'd never wear them again. Prue's throat tightened as she lifted out a simple brown work dress, softer than anything she'd owned in months. The sleeves would be too short, they'd barely reach her forearms, and the hem would hit mid-calf instead of her ankles, but they were dry and they were offered freely, and that made them more valuable than silk. She dressed quickly, her teeth chattering, then stepped out from behind the screen. Cade was at the fireplace, stirring a pot that hung over the flames, and the smell of beef stew hit her so hard she nearly wept again. When had she last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? She'd lost track somewhere between the last town that had run her off and the endless gray miles of rain-soaked prairie. Cade glanced up, then did a double take. The dress fit her all wrong, too short in the arms and legs, tight across her broad shoulders. But something in his expression shifted. Not pity, not disgust at how masculine her frame looked in women's clothing. Something else, something that looked almost like appreciation. "You look half frozen still," he said, ladling stew into a tin bowl. "Sit by the fire. Eat." Prue moved to the wooden chair he'd pulled close to the hearth, sinking into it with a groan she couldn't suppress. Every muscle in her body screamed from 17 miles of walking. Cade handed her the bowl and a spoon, and when their fingers brushed, she flinched. He noticed. Of course he noticed. But he didn't comment, just settled himself on the floor across from her, his own bowl in his hands, giving her space. The first spoonful of stew was heaven. The second made her realize how close to starvation she'd been. The third made her slow down before she made herself sick. Cade ate silently, watching the fire, giving her the dignity of not staring while she devoured her food like an animal. But after a few minutes, he spoke. "You said you tried 5 towns looking for work. What kind of work were you seeking?" Prue swallowed hard. "Anything. Laundry, cooking, cleaning. Even asked about factory work in Cheyenne." She stared into her bowl. "Nobody wanted me. The women said I'd scare their children. The men said I'd make their workers uncomfortable. One factory foreman laughed and said maybe I should join the circus, find myself a tent show that needed a strong woman act." Cade's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Their loss. Their profound loss. That's kind of you to say, but I'm not being kind. I'm being practical." He set down his bowl and leaned forward, firelight dancing across his weathered face. "This ranch is barely hanging on. My shoulder's been bad since a horse fell on me back in September. I can't do the heavy work anymore. Can't lift fence posts, can't handle the ornery cattle, can't even chop enough firewood to get through winter. I've been letting things fall apart because I couldn't afford to hire help and couldn't do it myself." He paused. "You said you're strong. How strong?" Prue's spine straightened despite her exhaustion. This was familiar ground, proving her worth through labor, through the body that had always been both her greatest asset and her deepest shame. "I can outwork most men. I grew up on my father's farm, just me and him after Mama died. He taught me everything. I can rope, brand, break horses if needed. I can lift a full-grown calf, carry 100-pound feed sacks, dig post holes all day without stopping." She met his eyes. "I'm not delicate, never have been, but I'm reliable and I'm honest and I work until the job's done." Something sparked in Cade's expression, not just interest, but respect. "If I offered you work, real work, with wages when I sell cattle come spring, would you take it? Or are you just passing through?" The question hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Prue's heart hammered against her ribs. I've got nowhere to pass through to, no family left, no friends who'll claim me, no town that wants me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I'd work for room and board alone. You don't have to pay me. That's not how I do business, Cade said firmly. You work, you get paid. Maybe not much until spring, but fair wages for fair labor. That's the deal. He stood, moved to a small desk covered in papers and ledgers, rifled through them until he found what he was looking for. I can offer $30 for the winter, November through March, plus room, board, and any supplies you need. Come spring when we sell the herd, if you're still here and the ranch turns a profit, you'll get a percentage of the sale. Partners split the profits. That sound fair? Prue's vision blurred with tears she couldn't hold back anymore. $30. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than she'd had in months. More than that, it was dignity. It was a contract, a promise, a recognition that her labor had value. More than fair, she managed. More than I deserve. Stop that, Cade said, his voice sharp enough to cut. Stop saying you don't deserve things. You deserve shelter. You deserve food. You deserve to be treated like a human being with worth and dignity. The fact that you've been treated otherwise doesn't mean you deserved it. It means the people who treated you that way were cruel and small and wrong. He crossed back to her, stood looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You're going to hear me say this a lot, so you might as well get used to it now. You are not too tall. You are not too strong. You are not too much of anything. You are exactly who God made you to be, and anyone who made you feel otherwise was a fool. Prue couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the fact that this stranger, this lone rancher with his one bed and his broken shoulder and his cabin full of ghosts, was saying the words she'd needed to hear for her entire life. Words her own mother had never said, words Silas had tried to say but she'd been too damaged to fully believe, words that hit her now with the force of absolution. I don't understand, she whispered. Why do you care? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. Cade crouched down so they were eye level, his expression softer now but no less intense. My Martha was tiny, 5'0", delicate as a flower. Everyone said we were perfect together. Big, strong rancher, little sweet wife. Picture perfect. His voice went rough. She died screaming because her body was too small to birth our son, died in agony while I held her hand and couldn't do a damn thing to save her. You know what I learned that day? That there's no such thing as the right kind of body or the wrong kind of strength. There's just people trying to survive in a hard world, and we either help each other or we don't. He held her gaze. I choose to help, because nobody helped me when I needed it most, and I won't be that person for someone else. The pain in his voice was so raw, so honest, that Prue felt her own grief rising up to meet it. She'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will for 4 months, refusing to break because breaking meant giving up. But here, in this warm cabin with this broken man who somehow still had kindness left in him, her defenses shattered. I miss him, she sobbed, the words torn from someplace deep and wounded. I miss Silas so much it feels like dying. He was the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't a mistake. And now he's gone and his family hates me, and I don't know how to keep going when every single day is just pain and rejection and— I know, Cade said quietly, and she knew he did. Knew he understood the specific hell of losing your person and having to keep living anyway. I know exactly how that feels, and I'm not going to lie to you and say it gets easier, because it doesn't. Not really. You learn to carry it. Learn to keep moving even when moving feels impossible. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he rested his hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, respectful, but it grounded her. But you don't have to carry it alone. Not tonight. Not while you're here. Prue pressed her hand over his, holding it there against her shoulder, anchoring herself to this moment of human connection. I'll work hard for you, she promised through her tears. I'll earn this. I swear I will. I know you will, Cade said, and the certainty in his voice made her believe it might actually be true. But first you're going to sleep, real sleep, in a real bed without worrying about where you'll be tomorrow. Can you do that? She nodded, too exhausted and overwhelmed to argue. Cade stood, helped her to her feet with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough rancher's hands, and guided her toward the bed. The cream-colored quilt looked softer than clouds. He pulled back the covers and stepped away. I'll be right here by the fire if you need anything, he said. You're safe here, Prudence. I give you my word. And somehow, Impossibly. She believed him. Prue woke to pale dawn light filtering through the cabin windows and the smell of coffee brewing. For one disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The mattress beneath her was too soft, the quilt too warm, the air too free of the damp barn stink she'd grown accustomed to. Then, memory crashed back. The rain, the walk, the one bed, the rancher who'd given her kindness instead of taking what she'd offered. She sat up quickly, panic flaring. She'd overslept. She was supposed to be working, earning her keep, proving she wasn't a burden. The sun was already up and she was still in bed like some pampered lady instead of the hired help she'd promised to be. She threw off the covers and stumbled out of bed, her muscles screaming in protest. 17 miles of walking had left her body a wreck of aches and pains, but she ignored them. She couldn't afford to be weak, couldn't afford to make Cade regret his decision to shelter her. She pushed through the cabin door and stopped dead at what she saw. Cade was in the yard, struggling with a fence post that had obviously fallen during the night's storm. His right arm hung awkwardly at his side, the bad shoulder he'd mentioned, while he tried to maneuver the heavy wooden post with just his left. His face was twisted in pain and frustration, sweat beading on his forehead despite the November cold. He was wearing the same clothes from last night, which meant he probably hadn't slept much, if at all. "Stop!" Prue called out, moving toward him on bare feet that barely registered the cold ground. "You're going to hurt yourself worse." Cade looked up, startled, then immediately defensive. "I've got it. You should rest. You walked 17 miles yesterday. And you've got a bum shoulder that's getting worse every second you use it." She reached him and, without asking permission, took the fence post from his hands. It was heavy, maybe 80 pounds of rough-hewn timber, but she lifted it like it weighed nothing, positioned it in the hole he'd dug, and held it steady. "Pack the dirt around the base. I'll hold it straight." For a moment, Cade just stared at her, something complicated flickering across his face. Then, slowly, he grabbed the shovel and started packing earth around the post. They worked in silence, the only sounds the thud of dirt and the distant lowing of cattle. When the post was secure, Prue released it and stepped back, brushing her hands on the too-short dress. "How many more need fixing?" she asked. Cade's expression was unreadable. 12, maybe 15. Storm took out a whole section of the north pasture fence. He paused. "But that can wait. You need breakfast, you need proper work clothes, you need—" "I need to work," Prue interrupted, meeting his eyes. "Please. I need to feel useful. I need to do something other than—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain the desperate need to prove her worth, to transform yesterday's charity into today's earned shelter. Understanding dawned on Cade's face. He knew that feeling too, the need to work yourself into exhaustion so you didn't have time to think, to feel, to remember. "All right," he said quietly. "But you eat first. No arguments. Can't have my new ranch partner collapsing from hunger." Partner. The word hit her square in the chest, warm and solid. Not servant, not hired help. Partner. Like she was an equal, not a charity case. She followed him back to the cabin, and over a breakfast of biscuits and gravy that she ate too fast, they planned the day's work. Fence repair first, then checking the cattle, then chopping firewood for the coming winter. Cade would handle the lighter tasks, feeding the horses, organizing supplies, tending the vegetable garden that was barely hanging on. Prue would do the heavy labor that his shoulder couldn't manage. "I'll need to get you proper work clothes," Cade said, eyeing the dress that looked ridiculous on her frame. "Men's clothes, probably. Canvas pants, a good wool shirt, sturdy boots. Your feet are already torn up from yesterday." Prue looked down at her bare feet, noticing for the first time the blisters and cuts she'd been ignoring. "I can work in this. I don't need—" "You need proper gear or you'll injure yourself, and then where will we be?" Cade's tone left no room for argument. "There's a general store in town, about 8 miles south. We'll ride in tomorrow, get you outfitted properly. Today you can wear some of my old work clothes. They'll be too short in the legs, but better than that dress." The casual way he said it, the assumption that she'd still be here tomorrow, that this wasn't just one night of charity but an actual arrangement, made Prue's throat tighten. "You really mean this, don't you? The partnership, the wages, all of it?" Cade met her eyes across the rough wooden table. "I don't say things I don't mean. You're here, you're working, you're earning your keep and then some. That makes you my partner." He paused, something vulnerable crossing his face. "Truth is, I need you as much as you need me. Maybe more. This ranch was dying. I was letting it die because I didn't care enough to save it. But having someone else here, someone counting on me—" He shook his head. "It makes me want to try again. So yeah, I mean it. Every word." They worked until noon, repairing fence after fence, and Prue fell into a rhythm she'd thought she'd lost forever. The physical labor felt good, purposeful, necessary, valued. Cade worked beside her when he could, and when his shoulder forced him to stop, he sat on a nearby rock and talked to her. Not small talk, but real conversation. He told her about the ranch, about how his father had built it from nothing and left it to him when he died. About Martha and their short, happy marriage before tragedy struck. About the 3 years of isolation that had followed, the slow decay of everything he'd once cared about. "Why didn't you hire help before?" Prue asked, driving another post into frozen ground with a strength that made Cade shake his head in amazement. "Pride, mostly. Didn't want to admit I couldn't do it alone. Didn't want strangers around asking questions, offering sympathy." He watched her work, and there was something in his gaze that made her skin warm. Not hunger. She knew that look, and this wasn't it. This was admiration, respect. "You're incredible at this, you know that?" Prue's hands stilled on the post. "I'm just doing what needs doing." "No, you're doing what 3 men couldn't do, and you're doing it like it's nothing." Cade stood, moved closer, examined her work with a critical eye that turned approving. "These posts are set better than anything I've done in 5 years. Straight, secure, deep enough to hold through any storm." He looked at her. "Where did you learn this?" "My father. He said if I was going to be big, I might as well be useful." The words came out bitter. She'd never meant them to sound that way, but there they were, the truth of her childhood, valued only for her labor, loved conditionally on her productivity. Cade heard the bitterness, and his expression darkened. "Your father said that to you?" "He wasn't cruel. He didn't know what to do with a daughter who could outwork his hired men by age 12. He tried to make me useful since I'd never be pretty." Prue lifted another post, avoiding Cade's eyes. "He was right. I am useful. That's enough." "It's not enough." Cade's voice went hard, the same protective fury from last night returning. "Being useful isn't the price of being loved, Prudence. It's not the price of being valued. You could be completely useless and you'd still deserve kindness and respect and—" "But I'm not useless," Prue interrupted, something desperate in her voice. "That's the thing. I can work. I can contribute. That's what makes me worth keeping around." Cade grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly enough to make her stop and look at him. "Is that what you think? That I'm keeping you around because you can lift fence posts?" His eyes searched hers, intense and pained. "Prudence, if you couldn't lift a damn thing, if you couldn't work a single day, you'd still be welcome in my cabin. You'd still deserve that bed, that food, that shelter. Because you're a human being in need and I'm a human being with resources to share. That's it. That's the whole equation." Prue's vision blurred. "Nobody's ever said anything like that to me before." "Then you've been surrounded by fools your whole life." Cade released her arm but didn't step back. "I'm not them. I won't be them, and I need you to understand something. When I offered you this partnership, it wasn't just about labor. It was about having another living soul around who understands what it's like to lose everything and keep going anyway. Someone who knows grief isn't weakness and survival isn't shameful." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "You make this place feel less empty. That's worth more than all the fence posts in Wyoming." The air between them went thick and charged. Prue couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the fact that this man, this stranger who'd known her less than 24 hours, was looking at her like she mattered, not for what she could do, but for who she was. Her pulse hammered in her throat, and she didn't know if it was fear or something else entirely. "I should get back to work," she whispered, because she didn't know what else to say, didn't know how to respond to kindness this overwhelming. Cade nodded, stepping back, giving her space. "Yeah, me too." But as he walked away to check on the horses, he glanced back at her once, and the look in his eyes made her heart stutter in her chest. It was the look of a man who'd been alone too long, who'd convinced himself he'd never feel anything again, suddenly realizing he might have been wrong. They worked until sunset painted the sky orange and gold, and when they finally trudged back to the cabin, exhausted and dirt-covered, something had shifted between them. Something subtle but undeniable. They were still strangers, still 2 broken people barely holding themselves together. But they were strangers who'd started to see each other, really see each other, and that was more terrifying and more hopeful than anything either of them had felt in years. 3 months passed like a dream Prue kept expecting to end. Winter came hard and brutal, trapping them in the cabin for days at a time, forcing an intimacy neither had anticipated. They learned each other's rhythms, how Cade took his coffee black and brooding, how Prue hummed old hymns while cooking, how they both woke screaming from nightmares and pretended they hadn't. The one bed became a symbol of everything unspoken between them. Every night Cade insisted she take it. Every night she felt guilty. Every night the distance between the bed and his spot by the fire felt like both a chasm and a fragile thread holding them to propriety. But February brought a thaw, and with it, a breaking point neither could avoid. They were in the barn checking a mare about to foal when Prue slipped on ice-slicked hay. Cade caught her, his good arm wrapping around her waist, and suddenly they were pressed together, breathing hard, staring at each other with months of denied longing blazing between them. Cade, she whispered, and it sounded like a prayer and a question and a surrender all at once. He cupped her face with trembling hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. Tell me to stop. Tell me this is just gratitude or loneliness or anything else, and I'll step away right now. But Prue, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel. She kissed him, desperate and clumsy and perfect, kissed him like he was air and she'd been drowning. He made a sound deep in his throat and pulled her closer, kissing her back with a hunger that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both, gasping, his forehead rested against hers. I love you, he said, simple and devastating. I know it's fast and maybe crazy, but I love you. Your strength, your courage, the way you've brought this ranch back to life. The way you've brought me back to life. Prue's tears came hot and fast. I love you too. God help me, I do. But Cade, what if I'm not enough? What if? You're everything, he interrupted fiercely. Everything I didn't know I needed. Everything I thought I'd lost forever. He kissed her again, softer this time. Marry me. Be my wife, my partner, my everything. Share that bed not because there's only one, but because you want to. Because we choose each other. Yes, she sobbed against his mouth. Yes, yes, yes. That night, the one bed finally became theirs together, not from desperation or obligation, but from love. Cade worshipped every inch of her, whispering how beautiful she was, how perfect, how magnificent, made her believe for the first time in her life that her body wasn't something to apologize for, but something to celebrate. They came together with tears and laughter and a tenderness that healed wounds neither had thought could heal. Afterwards, wrapped in each other's arms, Prue whispered, I came here ready to give you everything just to survive one night. Cade kissed her temple. And instead, you gave me a reason to live again. Funny how God works. Spring came with new calves and the best cattle sale the ranch had seen in years. They married in the cabin, just them and a traveling preacher, with wildflowers in Prue's hair and tears on both their faces. The town still whispered about the too tall woman and the grieving rancher, about impropriety and desperation. But standing in that cabin with golden light streaming through the windows, looking at the man who loved her exactly as she was, Prue couldn't bring herself to care. My room only has one bed, Cade had said that frozen November night, and Prue had been willing to spread herself on the floor, sacrifice her dignity, do whatever it took just to survive. But love, real, honest, transformative love, had turned that one bed into a sanctuary, had turned two broken strangers into partners, lovers, soulmates, had proven that sometimes the most desperate moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings, and sometimes the price of staying isn't what you give up, but what you finally allow yourself to receive. She'd come to his door, homeless and hopeless, offering everything because she had nothing left. He'd given her shelter, purpose, dignity, and finally love. The one bed that had seemed like a symbol of her desperation became the place where they built their future, where they whispered dreams in the darkness, where they held each other through grief's aftershocks, where they created the family they'd both lost. 2 years later, Prue stood on that same porch, one hand on her swollen belly, watching Cade work with their expanded herd. The ranch thrived, now employing 3 full-time hands, known throughout Wyoming for its quality cattle and the unusual partnership at its heart. People still stared at the tall, powerful woman and her devoted husband, still whispered about how unconventional they were. But the whispers had changed, from mockery to grudging respect to something almost like admiration. Cade looked up, caught her watching, and his whole face transformed with a smile that still made her heart race. He jogged to the porch, placed his hand over hers on her belly, felt their child kick. You thinking about that first night again? He asked, reading her expression with the ease of long intimacy. Always, she admitted. Thinking about how close I came to walking past your cabin, how I almost kept going into the dark because I was too proud to beg for help one more time. Cade pulled her close, careful of her belly. Thank God you didn't. Thank God for that storm, and my one bed, and your courage to knock on a stranger's door. He kissed her softly. You saved me, Prue. I was dying in that cabin, dying inside, and you brought me back. We saved each other, she corrected, threading her fingers through his. You gave me back my dignity, my worth. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. Their daughter was born that spring, strong and healthy, with her mother's powerful build and her father's gentle eyes. They named her Grace, for the grace that had brought two desperate souls together, for the grace that had turned desperation into devotion, for the grace that proved love could bloom even in the hardest soil. And every night, as they settled into their bed, the bed that was no longer too small or too symbolic or too anything except exactly right, Prue remembered the woman she'd been that frozen November night, remembered offering to spread herself on the floor just to survive. And she thanked God for the man who'd seen past her desperation to her worth, who'd turned her sacrifice into sanctuary, who'd proven that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the smallest kindnesses. My room only has one bed, he'd said, and she'd thought it was a limitation, a challenge, a price she'd have to pay. Instead, it became the foundation of everything beautiful in her life, the place where loneliness ended and belonging began, where two broken hearts learned to beat as one, where a homeless widow and a lone rancher found their way home to each other.